what's your motivation for learning? This fits very well into cybernetic models of learning as well. Well, you're motivated to learn when what you do doesn't produce what you want it to do. So that's another description of pragmatism fundamentally. So remember, this is an action-oriented theory. You're specifying the outcome and then you're acting on the world in order to bring it about. And if it doesn't work, then you have to re-examine your assumptions. And then, or, it's funny, you have to re-examine your assumptions, which would be part of accommodation, because you'd be shifting around the assumptions of the theory within which you're operating. But you're also going to be assimilating new information too. So for example, you know, if maybe you're 15 or 16 and you've tried to establish a relationship with someone that you have a romantic interest in, and that's failed multiple times. Well, the first thing is, it's obvious that the set of assumptions that you're bringing to bear on the situation are inaccurate. And you might say, well, what's the evidence that they're inaccurate? And the answer is, well, you aren't engaging in any romantic relationships, and that's the whole point of the theories. So they're inaccurate insofar as they're not producing the desired outcome. Okay, so then you might say, well, what could you do about that? And one would be, well, you could gather some more information. So one of the things I do with my clients, for example, if they happen to be terrified of the opposite sex, which is, you know, generally that's a very high probability situation, I often get them to go to speed dating games, because they can interact with 20 people in the space of an hour or two, and it expands their knowledge of interactions and also their knowledge of the variability of the people that they're dealing with. And so it's a form of exposure. So you could say, if you're using the old kind of habituation theory, you could say, well, they're just getting accustomed to the situation. But that's rubbish. That isn't what they're doing at all. What they're doing is going in there and they're interacting, and each time they interact, they gather more information. And then what do they do with that information? Well, they build it into themselves. And that means that they start behaving differently, and they start conceptualizing themselves in the world differently. And so some of it's built in at a procedural level, which means maybe they become more fluid and less awkward in their nonverbal self-presentation, but at the same time they're also incorporating abstract knowledge that's going to help them expand their domain of competence. And so for Piaget, the motive is, if it doesn't work, well, then you should be motivated to fix it. Now, you know, that doesn't work under all circumstances, because sometimes if it doesn't work, it crushes you. You know, and so, well, that's something else we'll talk about here. So, okay, so this little diagram kind of points out a little more complicated version of that. So you're going from point A, which is the unbearable present, to point B, and there's more or less two things that can happen, and one is what you want to have happen, and the other is something other than you want happens. Now, sometimes the thing that happens that you don't want to happen is minor, in which case you can just modify. You don't have to change your whole theory, you can just modify one tiny sub-element of it and you'll get where you're going. So for example, if I wanted to walk towards that set of doors there, and I was going to do it blindfolded and I wasn't aware of this environment, I would walk forward until I encountered a desk, say, and then I could just feel my way around the desk and continue forward. So I wouldn't have to disrupt the whole plan, I would just have to alter microelements of it. But if I'm going to med school, hypothetically, and I write the MCAT and I get 30th percentile, which 30% of the people get, or lower, right, then you're not going to medical school. And so that requires a radical revamping of the system that you're using to schematize your world. And you know, you might say, well, that would be motivating to, that would motivate you to see what you did wrong and to change it so you could go to medical school, but sometimes it's just hopeless what you do. This is a radical act of accommodation, is you do something else. You know, and you might go through an intervening period of tremendous chaos. Well, everything has fallen apart into its subsidiary elements, and you have no idea how to unify that once again into an equilibrated state. So the diagram here shows you point A and point B. It says when you're going to point A, then what you want can happen, and that's great because you move forward, plus you validate the whole theory. Or you can move forward in something that you don't expect happens, and you don't understand it, and that stops you, and if it's bad enough, it invalidates the whole theory. Now you might ask, well, what's the difference between a small disruption and a large disruption? And that's a very complicated thing to figure out. But, and it took me a long time to figure this out, I would say it probably took 20 years, is that you could imagine that each of your schema, your systems of adaptation, work in a given area and across a variety of circumstances. Okay, and then you could say the most fundamental assumptions that you have are the ones that for you have worked across the broadest possible range of situations and time spans. So they work when you're alone, they work when you're with other people, they work in the short term, and they work in the long term. If you disrupt a schema that's a schema that has oriented you across wide swaths of time and space, then that's really going to dysregulate you emotionally. Whereas if you disrupt a schema that's only locally operating, like the table example that I gave you, well, it doesn't spread much. You can make a minor adjustment that's only relevant to this time and place. It'll produce a little burst of emotion, sometimes even positive emotion, because you just get curious about it instead of frightened.